My name is Nora Dalton, and I'm 28 years old. I never expected to be left holding someone else's baby while my entire family vanished without a word. I opened my phone one morning to a message from my mother. Just one line. "We've gone to Vienna. Don't look for us." No explanation. No goodbye. I rushed to the shared family account. Empty. I stared at the balance, then down at the baby boy sleeping in a tiny chair next to me. His name is Elliot. He's not mine. But in that moment, I knew he was all I had left. Before I tell you the rest, let me know where you're watching from. Drop a comment, tap the like button, and subscribe if you believe no one should ever be abandoned by the people they call family. That morning felt like falling through a trap door I didn't know was beneath me. I stood there in my kitchen, still in my robe, phone in one hand, bottle in the other. Elliot was cooing, his tiny fingers wrapped around the strap of his pacifier. I remember thinking, he has no idea. He had no idea that the people who were supposed to love him most had just disappeared. No note, no plan, just gone. I called my parents' phones, straight to voicemail. I called my brother, Michael, Elliot's father. It rang twice before it cut off. Then silence. That silence? It told me everything. I slid down to the floor with Elliot on my lap, his head resting against my chest. And I cried. I cried like I hadn't since I was a kid. It wasn't just the abandonment, it was the calculation. See, I was used to being the helper, the one they leaned on but never really saw. Need a ride to the airport? Call Nora, sick and need someone to pick up prescriptions? Nora's got time. Babysitting Elliot while Michael figured things out? That was practically written into my weekly schedule. But I always thought, naively, that love was somewhere in there. That I mattered. Turns out, I was just convenient.
After I managed to calm down, I did something I didn't expect to do that day. I went to the bank in person. I sat across from a young teller, barely out of college, who looked genuinely apologetic as she pulled up the account. "There's nothing here, Miss Dalton. The last transaction was a complete transfer 2 days ago." "Can I see the details?" I asked. She hesitated, then nodded. There it was. Every last dollar in our joint family fund, gone. Moved to a foreign account in Vienna, by my father. He didn't even have the decency to do it after he left. He planned it. Coldly, quietly. My chest tightened. Not because of the money, but because I realized something even worse. They hadn't just left. They'd planned to leave me with Elliot. On purpose. No conversation, no consent. Just silence, then a baby. I walked out of the bank, clutching a printout of the transaction, Elliot tucked into my coat like a secret. The wind hit hard that morning, but my body felt numb. I didn't know what I was supposed to do, who I was supposed to be. I wasn't a mother. I wasn't even sure I wanted to be one. But there he was, with his fuzzy hair, warm cheeks, and his trust in me that I hadn't earned, but couldn't betray. I walked home slowly, my boots crunching over old leaves, my mind replaying every recent moment with my family like a broken film reel. All the times they said they'd only be gone for a few days. All the times they thanked me with forced smiles. All the times they changed the subject when I asked if something felt off. Now I knew why. They weren't coming back, and I had a baby who needed more than someone to keep him warm for a weekend. He needed a future, a plan, a mother. And somehow, for reasons I didn't yet understand, that was going to have to be me. When I got home from the bank, Elliot was still asleep in the car seat I'd buckled into the back of my ancient Toyota. I sat in the driver's seat, keys in the ignition but engine off, staring at the dashboard like it might offer answers. The house felt different when I walked in. Quieter, heavier, like the air itself knew something had shifted. I carried Elliot inside and set him gently on the couch, propped up with pillows like I'd seen my mom do a dozen times. That's when I noticed the folder. It was sitting neatly on the kitchen counter, tucked under the edge of a tea towel. I hadn't put it there. I opened it, expecting bills or maybe a note, some pitiful excuse. Instead, it was a thick packet of legal documents. At the top, temporary guardianship agreement. My name bold and clean, the signature, my mother's, dated 2 months ago. I read it twice, then a third time, my hands trembling. They'd planned this. Not days ago, not last week, 2 months. They had been laying the groundwork while I was folding laundry, making bottles, telling myself I was just helping out. While I smiled politely and pretended not to notice their cold shoulders, their dismissive glances, their quiet whispering in the next room, I was never helping. I was being groomed. The shock turned to rage so fast I barely noticed it. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I wanted to scream, to throw the folder across the room, to call my mother and demand an explanation she wouldn't give. Instead, I did something that surprised even me. I sat down. I sat down at the kitchen table, placed the folder in front of me, and just breathed. Deep, intentional, shaky breaths. Because I knew if I started screaming, I might not stop. I picked up my phone and tried calling Michael again. Voicemail. I texted him, "Do you know what they did?" No reply. The sun was starting to set, casting long amber streaks across the kitchen tile. Elliot stirred and began to cry. I warmed a bottle, holding it while he drank, his small fingers curling around mine. And that's when I felt it. Not duty. Not panic. Something deeper. A tug in my chest, quiet but fierce. It wasn't his fault. He didn't choose this. He didn't ask to be left behind or passed off like a burden. He just needed someone. And I was the only one left. I rocked him until he fell back asleep. Then I wrapped him in a blanket, walked to the front porch, and sat in the cool evening air. The neighborhood was quiet. Somewhere, a dog barked. Across the street, porch lights flickered on like stars. I felt hollow, abandoned, but I also felt steady, because when everyone else had run, I hadn't. Maybe I wasn't ready. Maybe I was furious. Maybe I had no idea how I'd pay for formula next week, but I was still here. Then I heard the gate creak. I looked up to see Mrs. Calloway. She was in her 70s, hunched and slow-moving but sharp as a tack. She lived 3 doors down and always waved when I passed by with Elliot. In her hands, she carried a small pie dish wrapped in foil. "I heard him crying earlier," she said gently. "Figured you could use a break." I tried to speak but couldn't. My throat clenched. She didn't wait for permission. She sat beside me and handed over the pie. "Apple," she said, "and I didn't make the crust from scratch, so don't get too impressed." That made me laugh, or maybe sob, or both. She didn't ask questions, didn't press, just sat there watching the sky turn purple with dusk. And for the first time since the world flipped upside down, I didn't feel entirely alone. The first week after they left felt like I was stuck in someone else's life. I woke up every morning hoping I'd dreamed it all, that I'd open my phone and see a text from my mom, maybe something like, "Just kidding, we'll be back next week." But it never came. What did come were diapers, cries at 2 a.m. bottles that needed warming and laundry that never stopped. A tiny human who didn't understand betrayal or abandonment or legal guardianship. He only knew hunger and warmth and the sound of my voice. I had to figure things out fast. I couldn't afford to grieve. Grief didn't keep the lights on or the fridge stocked. The bookstore where I worked part-time only had me down for 15 hours a week. That wasn't going to cut it anymore. I walked into the manager's office on a Monday afternoon and said, "I need more hours. Anything. I'll take the garbage shift, I don't care." He gave me a look, half pity, half surprise, but he said yes. Then I took a second job. A friend of a friend managed a cafe near downtown and needed someone to cover morning shifts. It meant waking up at 4:30, juggling childcare, and sprinting between one job and the next like I was chasing a train I couldn't miss. I was tired in ways I'd never known. There were nights I'd sit on the bathroom floor, head resting against the wall, listening to Elliot cry through the baby monitor while I counted quarters to see if I could afford formula and gas in the same week. The answer was usually no. I pawned a few old pieces of jewelry. Nothing sentimental, just things I'd been given and never wore. I canceled streaming subscriptions, stopped ordering takeout, and found a thrift store that sold baby clothes by the pound. I stopped buying coffee. That was the hardest one. Somewhere in the middle of it all, I forgot what day it was. I forgot how to rest. I was existing in short bursts, 4 hours here, 3 hours there, living from nap to nap, paycheck to paycheck. And yet, there was a strange kind of rhythm in it, a raw, exhausting heartbeat of survival. People started to notice the circles under my eyes, the way I'd blink too long at red lights. My hands shook when I poured coffee at the cafe. My coworkers didn't say anything, but I caught them watching me. Mrs. Calloway kept coming by, sometimes with muffins, sometimes with nothing but a gentle smile and a few minutes of her time. "You look tired," she'd say, handing me a banana she brought from home like it was gold. "I am," I'd reply, and we'd both nod like that was enough. She never asked too much, never dug deeper than I was ready for,
And maybe that's why I let her hold Elliot once while I took a 10-minute nap on the couch. She held him like he was made of glass and memories. One night, around 11, I found myself scrolling through job listings. I didn't even know what I was looking for, just something that paid enough, something that felt less like drowning. That's when I found a local moms group online. I hovered over the join button, feeling like an imposter. I wasn't a mom, not really. But then I looked over at Elliot, fast asleep in his crib, thumb near his cheek, breathing soft and steady. And I clicked join, because maybe I wasn't a mother in the way people expected, but I was the one still here. I hadn't heard from Michael in almost a month, which, in fairness, wasn't unusual. He'd never been the dependable type. He floated in and out of our lives like fog, there one minute, gone the next, leaving behind only damp traces of guilt. But this time was different. This time, he'd left behind his son. I tried calling him again after a long shift. My hands were still covered in flour from wiping down the cafe's pastry counter. He picked up on the third ring. "Michael," I said, already choking back whatever storm was building in my chest. He sighed before I even finished his name. "What now, Nora?" There it was, the tone, like I was bothering him, like I was always bothering him. "You know exactly what," I said. "Our parents are gone and I have your child. Your child, Michael. Don't you think I deserve something, a plan, a single explanation?" Silence stretched out, then his voice came back, flat, cold. "You always overreact. They needed space. They've done enough for you. Maybe it's your turn to step up." My laugh wasn't even a laugh. It cracked down the middle like thin glass. Step up? I wasn't even asked. They vanished. They left me a baby and a bill, and you're talking about taking turns? "I can't deal with this right now," he said. And then the call ended. I stared at the screen, still lit with his name. My hands were shaking, but not from anger, from betrayal. It was one thing to be abandoned. It was another to be treated like I'd asked for it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the floor by Elliot's crib, listening to him breathe, watching the way his chest rose and fell like the world hadn't changed, like it didn't matter who was missing, as long as someone stayed. I thought about our childhood then, me and Michael, back when he used to chase fireflies and I used to believe in promises. Our parents weren't bad people, not on the surface. They did all the things you're supposed to do. Birthday parties, new backpacks every fall, family photos at Sears with forced smiles and matching sweaters. But now, looking back, it all felt like set dressing, a stage play of what a happy family should look like. Underneath, there had always been something hollow, a performance. Affection came with conditions, attention came with strings. Love was a loan you were expected to repay, with silence, obedience, and gratitude. I guess I defaulted on my loan, because the minute I asked for answers, the minute I needed them, they were gone. I got up and found the legal folder again. Guardianship papers notarized, all clean and binding. They dotted every I and crossed every T. And nowhere was my consent. They had made a decision about my life without including me. They didn't just leave me holding Elliot. They trapped me with him, like I was the only card left in their hand. And maybe I was. Maybe I'd always been the backup plan. But sitting there, holding that folder under the dim light of my kitchen, I realized something else. They underestimated me. They thought I would break, that I'd panic, maybe drop Elliot at a fire station or call child services and walk away. But I didn't. I was tired, angry, hurt. But I was still here, and if I was going to be the only one fighting for this child, then I was going to fight like hell. A few days later, I was digging through the filing cabinet in the hall closet, trying to find Elliot's birth certificate. I needed it to apply for childcare assistance. The bookstore had offered to increase my hours, but I couldn't take them unless I had someone watching him. I pulled out old insurance forms, expired warranties, the deed to my car, and then a yellow envelope I didn't recognize. It was thick, heavy in the hand. Inside were a stack of neatly clipped documents, official-looking papers with embossed stamps. The top one read, "Affidavit of Guardianship." I froze. This wasn't just a form. This was a complete legal packet, with my name listed as Elliot's guardian, signed by my mother, witnessed by a notary, filed at the county courthouse, dated 8 weeks before they disappeared. 8 weeks. I sat back on the floor and let the papers slide into my lap. They'd done it. They'd quietly transferred custody of Elliot to me while still acting like I was just helping out. They smiled through dinners, left thank you notes on the counter, and promised to be back by Sunday. While all along they were legally removing themselves from his life and handing him off like a used suitcase. The precision of it made my skin crawl. They'd gone through every legal step, every bureaucratic form, and never once thought I deserved a conversation. No phone call, no sit-down over coffee, not even a scribbled post-it, just signatures. The betrayal felt so calculated, so surgical, it knocked the wind out of me. I couldn't even cry. My tears were somewhere far away, tucked behind a dam of shock and exhaustion. Elliot was napping in the next room, and I walked over like I was underwater. He was sprawled out, arms wide, lips parted in sleep, completely unaware that he had been passed off like a chore. But he wasn't a chore to me, not anymore. I watched him for a long time, thinking about what it meant to be chosen and what it meant to be abandoned. I'd always thought the two were opposites, that to be chosen was to be loved and to be abandoned was to be forgotten. But now I knew the truth. Sometimes they're the same thing. Sometimes people choose to abandon you because they know you'll survive, because you're strong, because they trust that you'll handle it, even when they shouldn't. And maybe that's what hurt the most. Not that they thought I couldn't do it, but that they assumed I would, that I'd carry the weight, clean up the mess, sacrifice my life quietly, because that's what I'd always done. I walked back to the kitchen and laid the documents out on the table. My eyes scanned the legal language again, the seals, the stamps, the lines that changed the course of my entire future. I could fight this. Legally, I could challenge the guardianship, claim it was signed under false pretenses, say I wasn't informed, that I never consented. But as I stood there in that tiny kitchen, with a baby monitor buzzing softly behind me, I realized something. I didn't want to give him back. Not to them. Not to anyone who could walk away so easily. If this was what being a parent looked like, no roadmap, no approval, just waking up and showing up, then maybe I was already doing it. Maybe I'd been doing it longer than I thought. The next morning I was washing bottles at the sink when the doorbell rang. Elliot had just gone down for his nap. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened the door slowly, half expecting another delivery person, or maybe someone selling roof repairs. But it was Mrs. Calloway again. She held a basket of warm rolls and wore a scarf the color of rust and maple leaves. Her eyes scanned my face like she already knew I hadn't slept. "I thought you might need lunch," she said, brushing past me without waiting for an answer. She was the only person in weeks who came without needing something from me, who didn't flinch at the sound of a baby crying, or ask me if I was doing okay in that way people do when they're more curious than concerned. She moved around the kitchen like it was hers, pulled plates from the cabinet, poured us both tea. When she finally sat across from me at the table, her gaze softened. "I heard about your parents," she said quietly. I stiffened. "What about them?" Her fingers wrapped around the teacup. She didn't blink. "They told me last month they were planning to travel for a while, asked if I'd keep an eye on the place, said you'd be watching Elliot more often." My mouth went dry. "Last month?" I asked. She nodded. "They didn't say much, just that they needed space and that things were getting too complicated at home. I figured it was just family drama. God knows I've seen enough of it in my time, but they made it sound final." I stared at the steam rising from my tea, my chest tightened. "So they told you," I said, "but not me." "I'm sorry, sweetheart," she said. "I thought you knew." I swallowed hard. I didn't, not until they were already gone. For a moment, the only sound was the tick of the kitchen clock. Then she reached across the table and placed her hand gently over mine. Her palm was warm, her skin papery but strong. "Some people run away from the messes they made, but others stay and clean it up. Doesn't mean it's fair. But it does mean you're the one with the strength." Her words cracked something open in me. Not the kind of break that hurts, but the kind that lets the light in. Because she wasn't wrong. I hadn't chosen this. But I hadn't run either. That night I rocked Elliot to sleep with my cheek pressed to the top of his head. His little breaths puffed against my collarbone, his tiny hands curled into fists. I whispered things I didn't even know I believed yet. "We're okay. We're going to be okay. I've got you, I promise." After I laid him down, I stayed by the crib for a long time. Not because I was scared, but because I realized something else, something that would stick with me forever. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was choosing. Not out of obligation or guilt, but out of love. The kind of love that shows up, even when no one's watching. The kind that gets up at 4 a.m. and makes bottles and rocks a baby back to sleep without expecting praise or recognition. The kind that doesn't flinch when the paperwork says this is forever. And in that quiet room, with nothing but the hum of the heater and the soft rise and fall of Elliot's breathing, I finally understood what that meant. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was beginning to belong. A week after finding the guardianship papers, I made an appointment with a lawyer. I didn't even know what I was asking for. I just knew I couldn't keep living in this fog where everyone else got to make decisions about my life, and I was left picking up the pieces. His name was Gideon Marsh. His office was small, tucked between a dry cleaner and an old diner on the east side of town. The waiting room smelled like lemon cleaner and old carpet. There were no fancy awards on the walls, no degrees in gold frames, just a small plant on the windowsill and a stack of legal pads on his desk. He looked to be in his 60s, gray at the temples, calm in that way people get when they've seen too much to be easily surprised anymore. When I told him my story, he didn't interrupt. He didn't tilt his head or narrow his eyes or offer a pitying smile. He just listened. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "Let me make sure I've got this straight," he said. "Your parents disappeared, left the country, emptied a shared family account, left you with an 8-month-old and a stack of legal documents naming you as guardian, all without telling you." I nodded. He whistled softly. "And your brother?" "Won't take my calls, told me to stop overreacting." Marsh exhaled through his nose. "Lady, that's not just a messy family situation. That's a deliberate, calculated abandonment, and depending on the financial details, it may also be a case of coercion or misappropriation." I blinked. "You mean this is illegal?" "It's complicated," he said. "Family law always is. But what they did, that's not just rude, it's abuse. They didn't just leave you holding a child. They signed away responsibility, drained your resources, and cut off contact. That's not family. That's a hit and run." The room tilted slightly as I tried to take in his words. I hadn't let myself call it abuse. I hadn't wanted to see it that clearly. But once he said it, I couldn't unhear it. Abuse. Not a misunderstanding, not a miscommunication, not an accident, abandonment with intent. "What do I do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He leaned forward. "First, we establish financial damage, get statements from the bank, document the timing of the transfers, compare that to when the guardianship was signed. Second, we record your attempts to reach them and your brother's responses. Third, we look at how this affects your legal standing with the child." I swallowed hard. "And then what?" He gave a small smile. "Then we make sure this never happens again, and if we're lucky, we hold them accountable." I left the office with a folder full of instructions and a new kind of energy I hadn't felt in weeks. Clarity. It didn't erase the exhaustion or the fear, but it cut through the haze. I had a direction now. A map, even if the terrain ahead was rough. That night, while Elliot slept in his crib, I sat at the dining table sorting through bills and old emails. I printed every bank transaction from the last 3 months. I highlighted transfers I didn't authorize. I dug up texts from my mom, ones where she'd thanked me for helping just a few more days and promised they'd be back before the weekend. It was all there. The lies, the timeline, the setup. Mrs. Calloway came by the next morning with a tin of oatmeal cookies. She sat on the porch while Elliot played with a plastic spoon on a blanket. I told her about the lawyer. She didn't say much, just nodded slowly and said, "Good. You deserve someone in your corner." I looked at Elliot, who was babbling to himself like he understood the whole world already. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was barely surviving. I felt like I was beginning to fight. Over the next week, my house turned into a kind of war room. Papers spread across the kitchen table, post-it notes on the fridge with dates and names. I stayed up late, not because Elliot kept me up, he was actually sleeping better, but because the adrenaline wouldn't let me rest. I was tracking everything now, every dollar that left the joint account, every email from my mother, every unanswered message to Michael. It's strange what memory can do when you give it a mission. Things I hadn't thought about in months came back with painful clarity. I remembered the exact moment 2 months ago when my mother had dropped Elliot off in a hurry, said she had a hair appointment and couldn't be late. She'd smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'll be back in 2 hours,"
she'd said, pressing a bottle into my hand. She didn't come back that day. Michael picked Elliot up 6 hours later with a distracted apology and no explanation. Now I realized it wasn't forgetfulness. It was rehearsal. They'd been training me, one abandonment at a time. Gideon called every few days to check in. I wasn't used to that kind of consistency. Not from family, not from professionals. It felt grounding. "Don't throw anything away," he told me. "Even if you think it's minor, screenshots, voicemails, bank notices, we build a wall one brick at a time." So I saved it all. I created a file labeled Evidence and another labeled Elliot's Future. One was full of hurt, the other hope. I also started talking to neighbors, carefully, casually. Mrs. Calloway was first, of course. She remembered the moving truck. Said she saw my parents loading up suitcases late at night 2 days before they left. "I figured they were going on a long trip," she said. "Didn't realize it was a disappearing act." Mr. Browning from across the street said he'd noticed my brother coming by less and less. "You were out there with the baby almost every day? Figured you were the mom?" That stung more than I expected. Not because he was wrong, but because he was right. By the second week, Gideon and I had built a full timeline. He was impressed. Said I was more organized than half his paralegals. I laughed, even though it wasn't funny. Desperation has a way of sharpening your focus. I learned terms I'd never known before. Constructive abandonment, financial malfeasance, unauthorized transfer of assets. The more I learned, the angrier I became. Not just at what they did, but how easily they'd done it. How simple it was to erase someone from their own life when they trusted too much. And I had trusted them. My whole life I had tried to earn their approval, their warmth. I'd shown up, been reliable, played the good daughter while Michael played the golden son. Now I was the one left with the mess. But maybe that also meant I was the one with the power. One night, after Elliot had gone down early, I found myself staring at the guardianship papers again. I didn't cry this time. I read them the way a detective reads a crime scene, looking for fingerprints, and they were all over the place, little clues of who they really were, tucked between the legal jargon. No emergency contact, no timeline for return, no mention of medical care, education, or financial support. Just one cold signature, as if signing him away was as easy as canceling a magazine subscription. But the truth was, they hadn't just signed Elliot over. They had signed me off too, written me out of the family story with the flick of a pen. But this time, I wasn't going quietly. This time, I was writing myself back in. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I had just finished folding what felt like the 100th load of laundry that week. Elliot was sitting on the floor nearby, surrounded by a fortress of throw pillows and a few plastic stacking cups he never really used the right way. He had a way of examining each toy like it was the first time he'd ever seen it. His curiosity wasn't loud or frantic. It was focused, gentle, patient. I watched him as he babbled to himself, his little hands picking up one cup and trying to fit it into another. He kept getting it wrong, then looking up at me for a moment, not frustrated, just wondering. "Try flipping it over," I said. He didn't understand, of course, but he smiled anyway, like the sound of my voice was all the encouragement he needed. And then it happened. He looked straight at me, eyes wide and clear, and said it, soft and round like a whisper through a tunnel. "Nah." I blinked. He said it again, this time with more certainty. "Nah." I didn't move, didn't breathe, because I knew what that was. He was trying to say NORA, but he couldn't quite get it out, so he shortened it, like children do when they're reaching for something bigger than they can yet hold. Nah. It hit me in the center of my chest like a quiet explosion. I dropped the towel in my hands and walked over slowly, kneeling beside him. He touched my face, still smiling, completely unaware of what he'd just done to me. I wrapped my arms around him and held him close. It wasn't the first time I'd hugged him. Not the first time I'd wiped his nose or picked him up from a fall or rocked him to sleep. But this hug felt different. It wasn't about comfort or obligation. It was love. Not the kind you're told to feel because someone shares your DNA. Not the kind that's expected just because you happen to be standing in the right family photo. This love came from the hours. The quiet ones. The hard ones. The ones where no one was watching. The mornings I poured cereal with one hand and held him with the other. The nights I paced the hallway singing softly while he cried on my shoulder. The hours spent learning what every little sound he made meant. That kind of love doesn't arrive like lightning. It grows slowly, silently, until one day it wraps around you so completely you can't remember what it felt like to live without it. That day, I sat on the floor with Elliot in my lap for what felt like hours, just rocking gently, listening to him babble, letting my tears fall silently into his hair. And in that moment, the idea of giving him back or letting anyone else raise him felt unthinkable. I realized I wasn't just taking care of him anymore. He was mine, not legally, not biologically, but in all the ways that mattered. And somehow, without ever asking for it, he had become the anchor I didn't know I needed. Later that night, I called Gideon and left a voicemail. "I don't want just guardianship," I said. "If we go to court, I want full custody, permanent, and I'll fight for it." I hung up before I could overthink it, because I knew what I was doing. I was choosing him, not because I had to, because I wanted to. There was a rhythm to our days now. Wake up before dawn, bottle, diaper, coffee, feed Elliot while scrolling through job boards or checking Gideon's latest notes. Drop him off at a friend's apartment for a few hours while I worked a shift at the cafe. Pick him up, nap, then head to the bookstore for the evening shift. Dinner time was a mashup of microwaved leftovers and lullabies, bath, books, crib, and finally, silence. It was exhausting, but strangely peaceful. I was no longer living someone else's life. I was living my life. One I didn't ask for, sure, but one I had chosen to shape into something whole. Elliot had started reaching for me now, not just when he was tired or fussy, but when he was happy too. He'd crawl across the rug just to lay his head on my knee, then go back to playing like he only needed to check I was still there. That small gesture shattered me every time. I was still fighting the legal battle, still collecting paperwork, timestamps, copies of everything. But something had shifted. The fight wasn't about anger anymore. It was about protection. It wasn't just about what they had done to me. It was about what I wouldn't allow them to do to him. And then, one evening, they came back. No warning. No phone call, just a knock on the door. I was in the middle of feeding Elliot mashed sweet potatoes when I heard it. At first, I thought it was Mrs. Calloway again, maybe bringing over more of her famous cornbread. I opened the door with Elliot still on my hip. My parents stood there like they'd only been gone for the weekend. My mother wore a beige trench coat and carried a handbag that looked like it cost more than my rent. My father looked exactly the same, stoic, polished, emotionally unavailable. They both smiled. Soft, rehearsed. "Hi, honey," my mom said, as if we hadn't spoken in over 2 months. I didn't answer, just stared at them. Elliot's head resting against my collarbone, his fingers tangled in my shirt. "We thought we'd stop by," she continued. "We're back in town and wanted to see how things were going." I stepped outside, shutting the door behind me with a soft click. I didn't want their voices inside the place I had rebuilt. "You left," I said. "You took the money. You left me a baby and a signature." My father cleared his throat like he was preparing to explain a late credit card payment. "We didn't leave you, Nora. We just needed time. It was all legally handled." I laughed. The sound came out sharp and dry. "That's what you're calling it now? Legally handled?" My mother frowned. "You're upset. I understand. But it's time to move forward. We're family." "No," I said calmly. "Family doesn't disappear in the middle of the night and send a text from another country. Family doesn't turn love into a legal document and call it responsibility." She looked wounded, but it didn't move me. "We can discuss custody arrangements," she said, voice dropping like she was offering a compromise in a boardroom. "You've done a great job holding things down, but Elliot needs structure. He needs long-term planning." I shifted him on my hip and shook my head. "No. What he needs is someone who doesn't run when things get hard." My father finally spoke, the words low and heavy. "You're overreacting. This kind of stress isn't good for a child." I took a breath, slow and steady. "You're right, which is why he won't be seeing either of you right now." My mother's jaw tightened. "You can't do that." "I already did." I turned, opened the door, and stepped inside without another word. I didn't slam it. I didn't need to. The click of it closing was enough. Inside, Elliot stirred but didn't cry. He looked up at me, eyes wide and curious, and I smiled through the ache in my chest. Because for the first time in my life, I had chosen myself. And I had chosen him. The days after my parents showed up again were strangely quiet.
No more knocks at the door, no texts, no emails, just silence. The kind that doesn't come from peace but from people waiting in the shadows, hoping you'll crack first. I didn't. Instead, I poured myself into the routine I'd built. I got up, made bottles, worked shifts, rocked Elliot through teething nights, and filled out more legal forms than I knew existed. Every move I made was about stability. I wanted Elliot's world to be as predictable as possible, even if mine felt like a storm barely held back by drywall and duct tape. Then one night I walked into the living room and found him holding my shoe. He was standing now, wobbly and proud, and he held that shoe in his tiny hands like it was a trophy. He looked up at me, eyes wide, cheeks flushed from effort, and said it again. "Nah." Then he lifted the shoe up to me. I knelt down, smiling, and took it from him. "Thanks, buddy," I said. "Not quite bedtime, but good try." He giggled, the kind of full-belly laugh that only babies and old men can pull off. Then he reached for me. I picked him up and he pressed his forehead against mine. Just a second. Just long enough for me to feel the warmth of his skin and something deeper, the kind of connection you can't fake. That night, after he fell asleep, I sat beside his crib and watched the rise and fall of his breathing, and I let myself feel it fully. Not just the love, but the fear. Because now, I wasn't just fighting for custody. I was fighting for something I couldn't lose. He wasn't just someone I cared for. He was my son. Maybe not by birth, maybe not by blood, but in every way that mattered. I thought about the day I first held him, how small he felt, how unfamiliar. And now? I couldn't imagine a version of my life that didn't begin and end with his laughter. The fear was real, though, because love doesn't come with guarantees. And family, the kind I came from, had already proven how easy it was to walk away. I had to remind myself every day, I was different. I wasn't leaving. The next morning, I got a call from Gideon. "Thought you should know," he said. "They've hired a lawyer." Of course they had. "They're trying to build a case that you're unstable," he continued, "that you took Elliot under stress, that you're financially and emotionally unequipped to be a long-term guardian." I laughed, short and bitter. "They're calling me unstable?" I asked. "They left the country without a word." "I know," he said, "but they're banking on history, on perception, that if they look put together enough and you look tired enough, the court might blink." I looked around the kitchen. Dishes in the sink, a baby sock on the floor, crayon marks on the fridge. My life was messy, but it was real. "I'm not afraid of them," I said. "Not anymore." "I believe you," Gideon replied. "And so will the judge. We just need to keep showing the truth." After we hung up, I walked into Elliot's room. He was sitting in his crib, babbling to himself, surrounded by stuffed animals and a pile of board books he never tired of. I leaned on the crib rail, watching him, heart full and aching. "You know what, kid?" I whispered. "We're gonna be just fine, because I didn't just stay, I chose you." And every single day since, I'd chosen him again. The courthouse smelled like old paper and cold air. I arrived early, clutching a folder full of documents and clinging to the kind of calm that only exists when you've run out of panic. Mrs. Calloway had offered to watch Elliot for the day. She packed him a little lunch and gave me a hug that lasted a beat longer than usual. "You go in there and speak your truth," she said. "You don't have to be perfect, you just have to be honest." Outside the courtroom, Gideon met me with his usual steady nod. No false optimism, just presence. "They're already inside," he said. "Try not to react to anything emotional. Let the facts speak." I took a deep breath and pushed the door open. My parents sat at the opposite table, perfectly dressed and perfectly unreadable. My father wore a tailored navy suit. My mother looked like she was attending a charity luncheon, not a custody hearing. Michael sat behind them, eyes low, silent. I hadn't seen him since the day they left. The judge entered and we all stood. Her name was Judge Ralston. Late 50s, sharp eyes, no nonsense. She glanced briefly at the paperwork before raising her head. "This is a hearing to determine the custodial rights of minor child Elliot Dalton," she began. "The court recognizes that legal guardianship was transferred to Miss Nora Dalton by notarized document signed 2 months prior. However, objections have since been filed by the child's grandparents." My mother's lawyer stood first. He was polished, charming, with the kind of voice that made everything sound reasonable. He painted a picture of chaos. He said I was under severe emotional stress when I took custody, that I had no stable income,
that Elliot's placement with me had been meant as a temporary emergency solution while my parents arranged a longer-term care plan. He used words like overwhelmed, unprepared, financially insecure. He ended with a calm statement that nearly made me laugh out loud. "All my clients want," he said, "is what's best for their grandson." Then Gideon stood, and he didn't raise his voice. He didn't get theatrical. He just told the truth. He outlined the timeline, showed the bank records, highlighted the lack of communication, the vanishing act, the legal signature with no conversation. He submitted character references from neighbors, including Mrs. Calloway. He read out portions of texts and emails, messages where my parents had thanked me for stepping in with no mention of a return date. Then he said the line that landed like thunder in the room. "Intentional abandonment is not parenting. It's not love, and it's certainly not in the best interest of a child." The judge listened, occasionally taking notes. Her expression didn't give anything away. Then it was my turn. I stood up. My palms were damp, my voice unsure at first. But I looked at the judge, then at the people who raised me, and I found something steady inside myself. "I didn't ask for this," I said. "I wasn't prepared. But Elliot didn't ask to be left either. And I didn't run." I told them about the nights he cried with no one else around. The mornings I went to work with 2 hours of sleep. The fear, yes, but also the joy. The first time he laughed, the way he started reaching for me, the first time he said my name, or the closest thing to it. "I love him," I said. "Not out of duty. Not because I'm trying to prove anything. I love him because he's mine now, in every way that counts." The room was silent when I sat back down, and for the first time since all this began, my mother finally looked at me, not with smugness or dismissal, but with something close to fear, because maybe, just maybe, she realized, I wasn't the same daughter she'd walked away from. After I sat down, the courtroom felt heavier somehow. No one spoke for a few seconds. Even the court stenographer looked up from her keys, as if surprised by the silence. Judge Ralston finally cleared her throat. "I'll now allow rebuttal from the grandparents' counsel." My mother's lawyer rose again, his expression still calm, but now laced with a hint of irritation. He glanced toward my parents before speaking. "With respect to Miss Dalton's emotional statement," he began, "we must not confuse sentiment with suitability." He turned back toward the bench. "Yes, miss. Dalton stepped in during a difficult time. But she herself admits to being overwhelmed. She works 2 jobs. She has no spouse, no long-term childcare support. This arrangement, Your Honor, was never meant to be permanent. The grandparents had planned to return. They were monitoring the situation from abroad." Monitoring? That word made my jaw tighten. I looked over at my mother. She didn't blink. She looked serene, practiced. Then the lawyer said something that nearly knocked the air out of me. "And let the court remember, Miss Dalton has a documented history of anxiety. Hospital visit year before last. Prescription records show she was medicated for over 6 months. We are not judging that, Your Honor. But we are asking, is this the most stable environment for a developing child?" That was the dagger. I could feel my face flush, not with shame, but with fury. They were trying to turn my healing into weakness, my honesty into evidence. Gideon leaned toward me and whispered, "Let it go. I'll take this." He stood up slowly and adjusted his glasses. "Let's talk about that hospital visit," he said to the judge. "Yes, Miss Dalton sought care. That is correct. After losing her job, dealing with the fallout of a toxic breakup, and, ironically, feeling unsupported by the same family who now questions her capacity." He stepped closer to the bench. "What the opposing counsel fails to mention is that she got better. She went to therapy. She followed treatment. She took care of herself. Isn't that what we want our parents to model for their children?" He let the words hang in the air before continuing. "If anything, her resilience speaks volumes about the kind of mother she is becoming." I looked down at my hands, which were trembling just slightly, but not from fear, from power, because for the first time someone was defending me in a room where I used to only defend myself. The judge nodded slowly, jotting notes. Her expression hadn't changed, but I noticed how she tapped her pen differently when Gideon spoke. She turned to my parents. "Mr. and Mrs. Dalton, would either of you like to address the court directly?" My mother stood. Her voice was smooth, almost pleasant. "We did what we thought was best. Nora has always been sensitive, easily overwhelmed. We were trying to give her space.
A break. And the financial situation, well, it was complicated. We intended to replenish the account. My father didn't speak. He didn't even look up. Judge Ralston leaned back. So you left the country, transferred assets, left a dependent child, and told no one when you were returning. There was a pause. My mother smiled faintly. We thought Nora would understand. The judge let that hang for a moment. Thank you, that will be all for now. She stood, robes swaying as she exited the bench. Court will recess for 15 minutes. As the gavel struck, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Gideon looked at me. They're slipping. I nodded. But what I wanted to say was something else entirely. They weren't just slipping. They were unraveling. And this time, I wasn't the one falling apart. The courtroom settled again after recess, but the energy had shifted. The judge returned with sharper eyes, the kind that had started putting the puzzle pieces together. My parents looked a little more rigid this time. My mother had her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white. My father hadn't touched his water. Gideon stood and cleared his throat. Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to submit additional witness testimony. Judge Ralston gave a nod. Proceed. Mrs. Calloway walked in slowly, her cane tapping gently against the tile floor. She wore a deep green coat and a string of pearls that looked older than all of us, but her presence, commanding. She took the stand and was sworn in. Please state your name in relation to the case. Margaret Calloway, she said clearly. I live next door to Nora Dalton. And how long have you known Miss Dalton? Since she was 12. I watched her grow up, watched her mother drop Elliot off more and more often in the months before they left. There was a rustle on the other side of the room. Gideon smiled. Would you say that drop-offs increased before the family departed for Vienna? Oh yes, she said. Started off once or twice a week. Then by the end that baby was at Nora's house nearly every day. And did Miss Dalton ever express knowledge that she was being made permanent guardian? Mrs. Calloway shook her head slowly. She was blindsided. She called me crying that morning, still holding her phone in one hand and a baby bottle in the other. Gideon leaned in. In your opinion, has Miss Dalton cared for Elliot appropriately since then? Mrs. Calloway's voice softened. She's been the best mother that boy could ask for. Better than the ones who left? My mother flinched at that, but said nothing. Gideon thanked her and allowed her to step down. Then he brought out the financial documents, bank statements, transaction logs, texts from my mother referencing money being moved for safekeeping. The final withdrawal matched the same day as the guardianship signature. Clean, deliberate. Then came the piece that landed hardest. A printed email, one we'd found just a week before in a forgotten family inbox still linked to a shared utility bill. It was from my father to a financial advisor, dated 2 months before their trip. We'll be overseas for an extended period. Please finalize the transfer to the Vienna account under Diana's name. My daughter will take care of the child temporarily. She's always been pliable. Pliable. That word echoed in the courtroom like a slap. Judge Ralston took the paper without a word, read it carefully, then looked up at my father. Would you care to comment on this? He didn't answer, just blinked slowly. My mother leaned over and whispered something, but he didn't move. That was when I realized something profound. They didn't think they had done anything wrong. They had convinced themselves it was practical, strategic, maybe even generous. Like handing off responsibility wasn't cruelty, it was logistics. But the court wasn't buying it anymore. The judge turned to Gideon. Thank you. I'll take all the evidence under review and return with a decision. The gavel came down. I sat there for a moment, hands clenched in my lap, heart racing. I hadn't won yet, but I knew one thing. They couldn't hide behind polite smiles and tailored suits anymore. The truth was on record now, and the story they tried to bury? It finally had a voice. The courtroom was quiet, that kind of quiet where you can hear every pen click, every nervous cough, every heart pounding in someone's chest. We returned after the break. The judge had called us back sooner than I expected. I didn't know if that was a good sign or a terrible one. I sat there, hands folded tightly in my lap, trying not to look at my parents across the room. My mother was busy fixing her necklace. My father stared ahead like he was waiting for a flight to be announced. Michael hadn't come back after the last recess. He was done playing neutral, I guess. Judge Ralston took her seat. She didn't smile. She didn't need to.
Her voice was steady, clipped, decisive. "I have reviewed the testimonies, documentation, and legal arguments presented. This case, while emotionally complex, is legally straightforward." She looked at me, just for a moment, then at my parents. Intentional financial reallocation, disappearance without a stated return, and lack of communication all point to a pattern of abandonment, not only of financial responsibility, but of the child's emotional welfare. My mother's jaw tensed, just slightly. While the grandparents argue that their actions were strategic and temporary, the evidence suggests a conscious decision to remove themselves from the caregiving equation entirely. She paused, then turned back to me. "Miss Dalton, you have demonstrated consistent, stable, and loving care under considerable hardship. You have built a life for Elliot when others left. This court sees no reason to disrupt that continuity." My heart stopped. Judge Ralston picked up the papers in front of her and spoke clearly. "Full and permanent guardianship of Elliot Dalton is awarded to Nora Dalton, effective immediately. Financial restitution from the previously shared account will be frozen pending further civil proceedings." The gavel fell, and it was over. No cheers, no dramatic music, just a sound that felt like the cleanest breath I'd taken in months. I didn't cry, not yet. I just sat there as the words settled into my skin. Permanent, guardianship, mine. My mother stood up slowly, like she couldn't quite believe it. "This is a mistake," she whispered to no one in particular. The judge had already left. My father didn't say a word. He simply walked out, stiff-backed and silent, as if pride were a rope wrapped so tightly around his neck he couldn't speak. I stepped into the hallway. The air felt different somehow, lighter. Gideon turned to me. "You did it." "No," I said. "We did it." He gave me a smile rare and warm. Then behind me I heard the sound of heels approaching. My mother. She stopped a few feet away, arms crossed, her voice quiet and cold. "You always needed someone to fight your battles for you." I looked at her. Not the version I remembered from childhood, but the woman in front of me now, the one who walked away from a baby like he was luggage. "No," I said. "I just finally stopped fighting for you." She opened her mouth, maybe to defend herself, maybe to throw one last stone, but I didn't wait to hear it. I turned and walked toward the elevator, toward the street, toward home. Because Elliot was waiting, and so was our new life, one that no longer had space for people who only stayed when it was easy. The first morning after the ruling, the sun came in softer, or maybe I was just noticing it again. Elliot was still asleep, curled up like a question mark in his crib, one chubby fist clutching his favorite stuffed giraffe. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee, listening to the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. It was quiet, but not the empty kind. This was the kind of quiet that follows a storm. For the first time in months, I wasn't bracing for the next call, the next letter, the next shoe to drop. The weight hadn't disappeared entirely, but it had shifted. It wasn't crushing anymore. It was manageable. And in that stillness, I could feel something unfamiliar. Hope. Later that day, Mrs. Calloway stopped by with a tray of cinnamon rolls and a potted plant I couldn't name. "Every home needs something green," she said, settling into the armchair like she belonged there. And honestly, she kind of did. Elliot toddled into the living room, his step still unsteady, his smile a full-body event. When he saw her, he squealed with delight and reached up without hesitation. "Now that," she said, scooping him into her arms, "is the look of a boy who knows who's got his back." I smiled and sat beside them. We didn't talk about the trial. We didn't talk about my parents or the frozen bank accounts or what might come next. We just talked about Elliot, about how he'd started dancing anytime music played, about the funny way he scrunched his nose when he didn't like a new food, about how he'd started calling his blanket Boo. It felt normal. And for someone who'd been living in survival mode for so long, normal felt like a miracle. That night, I lit a candle after Elliot went to sleep. Not for any specific reason. Just to mark the moment. The end of a chapter, the beginning of something else. I didn't know what kind of life we'd build from here. The apartment was still small. My job still paid barely enough. The future still looked like a puzzle missing half its pieces. But I had him. And he had me. And somehow, that made the picture clearer. The days started to take shape in a new rhythm. Elliot woke up earlier now, usually with a loud babble that filled the apartment like sunlight. I'd shuffle into his room half asleep, and he'd greet me with a grin like he hadn't seen me in years. Every morning he acted like I was his favorite surprise all over again. We had our rituals: toast with too much jam, music in the kitchen while I made coffee, books before nap time. I'd read them with silly voices just to make him laugh, even when my throat was tired from a long shift the night before. The bookstore kept me busy in the evenings, but the owner had started letting me take Elliot in for a few hours some afternoons. I'd spread out a blanket in the children's section, and while I shelved returns, he'd play quietly with blocks or flip through picture books. Sometimes customers would stop to say hello. "He yours?" they'd ask, smiling. And I'd say yes. Every single time I'd say yes. Because by then, I wasn't just saying it to them. I was saying it to myself. Yes, he's mine. Yes, this is my life now. Yes, I've chosen it. One Saturday, we planted the little green thing Mrs. Calloway brought us in a bigger pot. We put it by the window. Elliot liked to water it with a tiny plastic cup, half the water usually landing on the floor. But that plant? It started to thrive, just like us. On Sundays, Mrs. Calloway would stop by with something homemade: corn muffins, peach cobbler, a roasted chicken when she knew I hadn't had time to cook. She never stayed too long, but long enough to watch Elliot pull himself into her lap and fall asleep like it was the safest place in the world. I started calling her Gran when talking to him. He picked it up quickly. "Gan," he'd say, pointing toward her building every time we passed it. She didn't correct us. She just smiled. I knew it wasn't a traditional family, not in the way people write on Christmas cards. There were no matching pajamas, no framed portraits on the mantel. Just 3 people figuring it out day by day with a little bit of grace and a lot of stubborn love. But it was ours. And it was enough. More than enough. It's funny how healing doesn't come with fireworks. There's no dramatic music, no perfect sunset. Most of the time it comes in quiet ways, like when you realize you've gone a full day without feeling afraid. Or when you laugh at something, really laugh, and then catch yourself thinking, I haven't done that in a while. For me, healing came on an ordinary Tuesday. Elliot had just started preschool. He came home with glitter in his hair and a crooked paper crown he refused to take off. He ran straight into my arms, yelling, "Mama, look!" It stopped me cold. He'd called me Na for so long I didn't expect the shift. But there it was, as natural and certain as sunlight through the kitchen window. Mama. I sat down with him on the floor, crown and all, and hugged him tighter than I probably should have. Later that night, after he'd gone to bed, I pulled out an old journal I hadn't touched in years. I used to write in it when I needed to untangle things, when the world didn't make sense unless I spelled it out, one sentence at a time. I flipped to a fresh page and wrote 3 words. I stayed. I loved. That was the beginning. The rest poured out slowly, but steadily. I didn't write it like a diary. I wrote it like a letter. To the next woman who might find herself holding a child that isn't hers. To the daughter who was told she's too sensitive. To the woman who got left behind with nothing but a baby, a bottle, and a decision to make. I wrote about the bank account. The cold message from my mother. The fear, the fatigue, the moments I almost broke. But I also wrote about Elliot's first word. The way he danced to commercials. How he reached for me when he fell. How he called the moon ball for weeks. I wrote about Mrs. Calloway, about the cinnamon rolls, about the green plant that still sat proudly by the window, taller now, leaves stretching wide like it had always belonged. And I wrote this. Sometimes family leaves, and sometimes that's the best thing they ever did for you. I didn't write it to be bitter. I wrote it to tell the truth. Because people like to romanticize blood. They say things like, but they're your parents, or family is everything. But I've learned something different. Family isn't who shares your last name or who shows up for the holidays. Family is who stays when you're messy and scared and completely unlovable. Family is who sees you unravel and doesn't flinch. Family is a baby calling you mama, even though he didn't come from your body, but somehow still came from your heart. I printed what I wrote, stapled the pages together. I didn't publish it or share it on social media or turn it into a memoir. I just put it on a shelf in the living room. Because one day, when Elliot is old enough to ask questions, not just the kind about why the sky is blue, but the kind about who we are and where he came from, I'll give it to him. I won't sanitize the truth. I won't make villains or heroes out of anyone. I'll just let him read it.
And he'll see that his story didn't start with loss. It started with a choice. Mine. A few weeks later, we celebrated his birthday. His second, technically, but the first one that felt like ours. Mrs. Calloway came with balloons. I baked a cake from scratch, even though it was lopsided. Elliot wore a party hat for about 20 seconds before throwing it across the room. We laughed. We took pictures. We sang the birthday song twice because he clapped the loudest the second time. When the guests left and the apartment got quiet again, I scooped him up and sat with him in the rocking chair. He leaned his head on my shoulder, warm and heavy, already drifting off. I kissed the top of his head and whispered, "You were the thing I didn't expect. And now I don't know who I'd be without you." His breathing slowed. His fingers curled against my shirt. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I didn't just survive the storm. I had built a home in the middle of it. And somehow love grew there. Time passed the way seasons do when you're not watching closely. One morning I looked up, and Elliot wasn't a baby anymore. His legs were longer. His words came clearer. His curiosity now stretched farther than the four walls of our apartment. He asked questions I couldn't answer and told stories I never wanted to correct because they were always better the way he imagined them. We had fallen into a life, a real one. Not just something we stitched together in survival mode, but something that breathed with us. I had picked up a part-time job as a library assistant at the local branch. The hours worked with Elliot's school schedule, and the smell of old books felt like coming home. There was quiet there. Not the kind that echoes, but the kind that holds you. Elliot loved the children's corner. He'd race to the beanbags, pull out the same 3 books every time, and insist I read them in the same order. Mrs. Calloway still came by on Wednesdays. She no longer brought casseroles or muffins. These days she brought herself. A chair, a crossword puzzle. She said she came to rest, but I knew she came to stay close. Our apartment hadn't gotten any bigger, but it had more color now. Drawings on the fridge, finger paints on the table, little dinosaurs hiding under the couch. There was a peace to it all. Not perfection, just peace. Some nights I'd sit on the balcony after Elliot fell asleep, listening to the wind rustle through the trees in the parking lot. I'd look at the plant by the window, now grown into something tall and leafy and completely unrecognizable from the tiny thing it once was. Like us. Sometimes I'd catch myself holding my breath, waiting for something to fall apart again. But then I'd remember. I'd already lived through the worst parts, and I'd made it. Better yet, I hadn't made it alone. There was a boy sleeping inside who called me Mom. There was a woman next door who called me family, and for the first time in my life, I had learned to call myself enough. He was 6 when he asked. It was a rainy afternoon, the kind where the world feels smaller, quieter. We were on the couch watching raindrops race down the window, a blanket wrapped around both of us like a cocoon. He looked up at me, completely calm, and asked, "Did I come from your tummy?" There was no fear in his voice, just curiosity. I paused, heart catching a little in my chest. I'd rehearsed this moment in my head more times than I could count, but nothing really prepares you for the real thing. Not when the eyes asking belong to the person who made you braver than you ever thought you could be. "No," I said softly. "You didn't grow in my tummy, but you grew in my heart." He was quiet for a second, taking that in. Then he smiled. "Oh, that's why it beats so loud when you hug me." I laughed, and something inside me loosened. I had expected more questions, maybe even confusion. But kids don't need long explanations. They just need love wrapped in honesty. He leaned his head against me, like he did when he was smaller. And I knew then, this wasn't a secret we'd carry. It was a story we'd tell, together, again and again. A story about finding each other, about staying, about choosing one another every day. That night, after he fell asleep, I pulled out the journal again. I added a new page. He asked today, and I told him the truth. Not because I had to, but because I get to. Some people see family as something you're born into, a given, a default. But I think it's something you grow, like a garden, or a bond, or a little boy who once didn't know your name and now calls you his home. That night, Elliot fell asleep on my chest. His legs were longer now, and it wasn't as easy to hold him like when he was a baby. But somehow, we still fit, like puzzle pieces that had learned to curve into each other over time. The apartment was quiet. The city hummed in the distance. The plant by the window swayed gently in the breeze. I closed my eyes and breathed him in. His soft hair, his steady heartbeat, the warmth of someone who had made me a mother without ever asking to. I whispered into the silence, "You are the thing I never prepared for. And the one thing I know I can't live without." He stirred slightly, then settled again. In that moment, I didn't think about courtrooms or betrayal or the past. I just thought about now, about the weight of his little body against mine, about love, not the kind written in family trees, but the kind written in the daily act of staying. Love, I've learned, is not biology. It's presence, it's consistency, it's a decision. Love doesn't always come wrapped in familiar names or shared DNA. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in struggle, in the shape of a child left behind, and the arms that refuse to let go. I used to think family was something you were born into, but now I know it's something you build, something you protect, something you choose. And I chose to stay. I chose to love. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by who shows up when everything else falls apart. If this story moves something in you, share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances, in chosen families, in quiet resilience. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about the strength it takes to love fully and the courage it takes to stay. And remember, sometimes the greatest act of love is simply not leaving.